Up at a reasonable hour. I think we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Eugene Beach, and on behalf of the Highland Township Historical Society, let me welcome all of you to the first of two presentations. I try to avoid the term lecture on what I'm calling the Pioneer Experience. First and foremost, let me extend my sincere thanks to Kathy Buhner and all of the other folks here at the Highland Township Library for inviting me to give these presentations and also for providing the accommodations. We are truly fortunate in this township to have such a wonderful facility and also a staff that is so dedicated to helping us all foster a sense of community. So thank you, Kathy. Now, some years ago, I gave a series of talks on early Highland history at the Adult Activity Center, or whatever it was called at the time. And that series was a more or less chronological, year-by-year account, the kind of thing that most of us think of when you hear the word history. I started with the original government survey of the township back in the 1820s. Then went on to the beginning of settlement in 1832, talked about the founding of Spring Mills Village in 1848, and kind of ended up around 1900. This time I'd like to try something different by taking a more in-depth look at a more limited time frame, essentially the 20 years from 1832 when settlement began up until 1852, by which time we had become a more or less established community with villages, shops, craftsmen, and so forth. What I'm calling the pioneer period, and as it just so happens, that's also about one generation's worth. Kids born here in the early 1830s are coming of age by the time the pioneer period concludes. Those of you who attended my earlier presentation may notice some overlap in some of the remarks this evening. Forgive me for that, but I assure you there's a great deal of other information that will be new and hopefully interesting. And since everybody loves pictures, I'll be illustrating parts of the presentation with maps, drawings, and some other visuals. Needless to say, photos from the 1830s and 1840s are non-existent. But there are a handful that were taken later in the 1800s or early 1900s, and some of those should prove interesting as well. Now, most of you probably have at least a vague mental image of what pioneer life was like. Maybe you've seen movies or watched TV shows or read some historical novels, or maybe visited some historic village that's devoted in whole or part to early pioneer days. And that image probably includes a nice, neat little log cabin in the woods that's surrounded by a little garden, maybe a small field of corn out in the back, and there's the rugged pioneer on his trusty pony riding off into the sunset with his flintlock under his arm, while his beloved wife is taking a break from churning butter and waving goodbye. I like to call that the Fess Parker version of pioneer life, based on his TV roles as both Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. It is a wonderfully romantic and appealing image, but as I think you'll discover this evening, the reality was never as neat or tidy. On the contrary, it was often hard, cold, dirty, backbreaking, heartbreaking, and otherwise miserable. I fancy myself as something of a gentleman farmer. I plant a large garden every year. I cut down 2 or 3 trees, split a couple cords of wood, do that sort of thing. But when I read what these pioneer families faced, I have serious questions as to whether or not I would have made it. And that's what I'd like each of you to ponder this evening as we go along. Picture yourself as one of these early settlers that I'll be describing, and ask yourself whether you would be able to put down your cell phone and pick up an axe, or get up from in front of your TV screen and get behind a plow. And if, as I suspect, you have your own doubts, then hopefully you'll leave here with a deeper understanding and a greater appreciation for what these men and women endured in helping make our township a reality. Now, how do we know what everyday life was really like during the pioneer period? Well, the answer is by studying what the pioneers themselves had to say about it. Back in 1876, the centennial of American independence, folks all over the country suddenly discovered history, became mad about it really, national, state, and local. And among the groups that was established around that period was the Pioneer Society of the state of Michigan, later known as the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Society. And for the next 40 years, they published annual reports, typically 500 pages each, that were literally jam-packed with the recollections and reminiscences of the state's earliest settlers, many of these folks who were then in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Those books have been scanned, by the way. They're available on Google's Books, and they make for some very interesting reading. There are likewise a number of first-hand accounts that appear in various county histories, including the 1877 history of Oakland County. Last but not least, we are fortunate to have a small number of recollections by early Highland and Milford settlers. Some of these were written to share tales of the old days with family members. Others were published in the Milford Times, either as interviews or news stories, and others take the form of letters or diaries or other family papers. And of course, there's also a variety of maps, surveys, census data, and similar official records which help round out the picture. And I will be using or quoting from a lot of those various sources throughout this presentation. Lastly, let me say a word about how these talks are organized. The first is devoted to what I'm calling hearth and home. So the focus tonight is on the individual pioneer family, considered more or less as a self-contained unit. And we'll be covering topics such as shelter, land clearing, plowing, planting, livestock, etc. Next week, we'll cover what I'm calling the pioneer and his environment, and we'll step back a bit and try to see how the individual pioneer family interacted with others and with their larger physical and social environment, including such things as native peoples, the roads, local government, etc. I'll concede that's an artificial distinction, and there'll be times that we have to ignore it, but it should help keep things more or less organized and easier to follow. Now, with those preliminaries out of the way, try to imagine, if you will, being a prospective Michigan settler between, say, 1832 and 1840. Most likely you lived in western New York in what is known as the Genesee region. That's this area running from Rochester and Monroe County all the way over to Niagara, centered on Genesee County. Maybe you are a younger son whose father has passed away, and your older brother has bought out your share of the family farm, so you need to find one of your own. Or maybe you're the older son. Dad shows no signs of going anywhere, and that means you need to strike out on your own in order to find a place for your wife and growing family. Whatever the reasons, though, you've decided to come to Michigan, what is one of the first things that you may consider doing? Anyone?
Get some land.
Pardon?
Get some land.
Yeah, get some land. We're getting there. All right, anyone else? Just ideas? Go ahead.
Find people of the same culture, nationality, you know.
There you go. Yeah. One of the first things, if not one of the most important things for any prospective settler during this period, is to talk with other family members, friends, neighbors, fellow parishioners, to see if they're interested in coming along with you. The Fess Parker image of the pioneer striking out on his own to live in blissful isolation out in the wilderness is simply not true for the vast majority of Michigan's earliest settlers. If you strike out alone and fall victim to illness or accident, you and your family may very well be done for. But if you come here with your brother or your in-laws or old friends or old neighbors or other people that you're associated with, then you have a group of like-minded folks around you who are willing to help through your difficulties, or maybe look after your wife and kids if something should happen to you. So here in Highland, for example, there are several cases, actually numerous cases, of siblings, in-laws, friends, neighbors coming here together or within a few years of each other. If we look at just immediate family members, they include, and I kind of ran out of room on this graphic, Rufus and Jesse Tenney, they were brothers, the Morse brothers, Abner Hyde and his father-in-law, who was father-in-law of one of the Morses, the three Stratton brothers, Enos Leake, who was a brother-in-law of the Strattons, the Dunham brothers, the Leonard brothers, and the McCall and Finley families. To that we could add some Lockwoods, the Teeples, and I'm sure there were others. Bakers, quite true, Thomas and his sons. In terms of folks who are coming from the same locality, we have over a dozen families that come from a little town called Parma, Monroe County, New York. It's located about 12 miles west of Rochester, and among the families with ties to that locality are the Adams, Armstrong, Beach, Clark, Coonrot, Dunham, Leonard, Lockwood, Rowe, and Taggarts. Church affiliation was also an important tie. Many folks today are surprised to learn that what we call the West Highland Baptist Church had its beginnings in December of 1833. That's the same year that settlement began in earnest here, and it was more than a year before the township was even organized as a separate entity. If you go back and look at the origin of the West Highland Church members, however, you will find that half of them had previously been members of the Belcota Baptist Church in Wheatland, Monroe County, New York. And they all came more or less within a year or two of each other, settling in either Southwest Highland or over the border in Heartland, and I think one down in Milford. Now, as you probably noticed, several of the names appear on more than one list, but that's to be expected. The point is that many of Highland's earliest pioneers had at least one, and in some cases two or more of these ties to each other. So you could say that they weren't so much trying to build a new community as they were consciously trying to transplant or to recreate the community that they had left behind. In many cases in this state, that effort extended even to the names of the Michigan settlement. If you wonder why so many southeastern Michigan communities, counties, and so forth have the same names as New York communities and counties, that's why. Genesee County, Monroe County, Rochester, Avon, Bloomfield, those are all New York communities, and they all got transplanted by the younger generation out here. Again, these folks weren't trying to escape or forget their former existences. They brought the old community with them as much as they could. Sociologists like to call this phenomenon chain migration, because each settler is a link in a chain that is either being dragged along or in turn is dragging along another group behind it, and it's still going on. No matter what your feelings may be about current immigration policy in this country, chain migration is playing a big role. Whether you're from the Middle East or Latin America, folks don't come here singly. They come as families, they come as villages, they come as groups, because there is security and comfort in having family and friends that you can call upon for mutual support. Now let's assume you've made your preparations, you've raised some cash to buy government land, you've talked to your family and neighbors, and you're ready to head east. Most likely you would travel overland or via the Erie Canal as far as Buffalo. At that point you could get on a ship. There were steamships on Lake Erie by this time, and you could take a ship to Detroit. There were some folks, however, who made the whole trip overland. Some of them would cut across at Niagara and travel through Canada to Windsor and then be ferried over to Detroit. Some of the others, more adventurous ones as it turns out, would hug the southern shore of Lake Erie, and along the way they would have to navigate the so-called Great Black Swamp, which was a nearly impassable wetland that stretched all the way from Toledo to Sandusky. No matter what route you took, however, the timing of your trip might be something that you would want to consider. Understand now that folks came to Michigan every season of the year. So what I'm about to say was not a hard and fast rule. But if you had your choice, there was one time of year that was arguably better than all the rest. Anyone care to guess what that was? Huh? Spring. Well, close. As it turns out, late winter or very early spring, just before any serious thaw, was probably the most favorable time for several reasons. First and foremost was ease of travel. The leaves are off the trees. You can see where you're going. You don't have nettle and thistle and briars to get in your way. And the frozen ground meant that you could travel over a lot of these marshy spots that would otherwise be impassable. And of course, it's far easier to pull a sled or even a wagon over ice and snow than it is to drag it through 2 and 3 foot deep muck and wet sand. The cooler temperatures also meant that you and your team wouldn't overheat, and perhaps most importantly, there weren't any mosquitoes, deer flies, and all the other insects to bother you. It was also meant that you could arrive at your purchase and provide yourself with shelter before having to immediately switch gears and begin the process of clearing your land and getting in a crop. Here in Highland, for example, we find that the Tenney and Morse families came together in March of 1833 for their permanent settlement. The Rowe family is coming in May, so late spring. Cowell's family in May, and the Barrett family came in February. I'm sure there were others, but those are the only ones that I have specific months for. Now, regardless of when or how you got here, the next step involved, as was suggested, selecting and buying the land for your future homestead. So let me briefly describe that process. At the time settlement of Highland began, you could buy land from the federal government for $1.25 an acre. Cash on the barrelhead with a minimum purchase of 40 acres. So $50 would buy what most folks traditionally regarded as a farm big enough to support one man and his family. Most of our early settlers, however, opted to spend $100 and pick up 80 acres, and there were quite a few that bought even more land than that. Some of those may have wanted to keep the additional land for its wood or as a home of a younger son or other family member. Others of them were clearly engaged in just pure speculation, hoping to turn around and sell the excess for a profit to some later arrival. Now, how you decided to purchase your land varied. You could start by simply going to the government land office that was down in Detroit and buy your land sight unseen. That office had copies of the original surveys. This is the one for Highland, but those gave only a very crude idea of the terrain, the location of lakes, and so forth. So here, for example, we see a very rough outline of White Lake. Here's Lower Pettibone, a little bit of Dunham over here, and then in the notes are a description of some of the tree cover and topography at the various section corners and quarter section corners. So buying land sight unseen could be a risky proposition. It's no surprise then that many of our earliest settlers physically scouted out the area in person before they made their purchase. For example, Rufus Tenney and his brother Alva initially came to Highland in the fall of 1832. They trudged all the way out here, decided what land they wanted to buy, trudged all the way back 40 miles to Detroit, made their purchase, and then headed back to New York to make arrangements for actually moving their family and household goods. They were planning to return in the spring, but Alva Tenney's wife and her family didn't want him to go. So he sold out to his brother Jesse. And the irony is that by staying back in New York, Alva took sick and died within a year. Rufus and Jesse came out here, and they both lived to a ripe old age. Another option prospective buyers might utilize was to hire a so-called landlooker, basically a 19th century version of a real estate agent, to scout it out for you and make a recommendation. My great-great-grandfather, Michael Beach, appears to have performed that role on several occasions. He had been a surveyor back in the 1820s and had himself previously bought land and sold land in Troy, Southfield, and Bloomfield before coming to Highland in 1833. So he was pretty savvy about what might or might not make a good farm. In old Livingston County history, for example, says that in 1834, Beach was hired by William Dawson to scout out land out in Tyrone Township, Livingston County. There are also a series of deeds that indicate Beach bought land here in Highland on behalf of the Adams family. They were former neighbors back in Parma. He made the initial purchase, and within a month or so after they came out, signed the land over to them. Now, what kind of land would you look for? Well, first and foremost, you avoided lakes and marshes and other wetlands as much as possible. That seems very odd to us today, given the value that we place on lakefront property, but back then it made a heck of a lot of sense. There is no point in spending hard-earned cash on land that you can't make pay. You can't grow a crop in a lake, you can't pasture livestock in a lake, and you can't cut wood in a lake. And of course, lakes and marshes were also rightly felt to be unhealthy. At the time, they believed that the rotting vegetation and the damp soils gave off fumes or vapors that caused the notorious Michigan fever. In fact, that illness was malaria, as we'll talk about in a bit. And today we know that it was carried by the mosquitoes that were breeding in the wetlands. But still, they knew that marshy land was not something you wanted. So what sort of land would you look for? Well, most favored what was commonly called an oak opening. Oak barrens today, naturalists call them an oak savanna. This is, pardon me, this is a more or less mature stand of oaks and other hardwoods, which is open or free of any scrub, saplings, underbrush underneath. This is a photo of a fairly young opening that is located up in Michigan Center, Michigan. The process by which this type of tree cover formed is rather interesting. There were really two causes. The first was fire, either natural or as a result of a lightning strike, but more often intentionally set by the native peoples for the express purpose of clearing out the underbrush and stimulating the growth of grasses and other annual herbage that deer love. I mean, if you look at this, it looks like a suburban lawn, and we all know how the deer love our suburban lawns. And secondly, once those trees matured, and these are just beginning to, the canopies would grow to the point they begin to interlace, so that starting in late spring and throughout the summer and fall, very little sunlight would penetrate down in there. These are described as being twilight at noon underneath the canopy. Put those things together and you end up with a stand of timber like this that was really the best of all possible worlds for a prospective settler. You have mature hardwoods that are growing more or less straight, which can readily be cut and used to build a cabin. Since they're growing fairly far apart, you can walk through there or drive a team between them without snagging on briars or underbrush. And all those periodic ground fires, coupled with the composting of all the leaves that are falling every autumn, make for a very rich, loamy soil in which to plant your crop. All of which is one reason so many of Highland's earliest settlers chose to locate down here in the southwest part of the township, basically at the intersection of Hickory Ridge and Lone Tree Road. This is an area that quickly became known as the Tenney Settlement, since the red parcels here are where the Tenney brothers located. Not only were there oak openings there, but as you can see, there were not a lot of lakes or wetlands. Roe Lake in section 32 is about the only thing that's there. The land itself is also either fairly level or gently rolling, and indeed that part of town was known as the Tenney Plains for much of the 19th century. And we can see the appeal of this area as we go through the next couple of years. This is 1832, starting in September. Next we have 1833. You're beginning to see some infill around here, and the beginning of a small group up here. Then 1834, more infill in this area, another parcel that was sold up here. Notice nothing around any of the major lakes. They were avoided like the plague. There were, of course, some other factors at work, such as proximity to the old Indian trails, and we'll talk about that next week. The other thing, of course, is that once you had the nucleus of a settlement or neighborhood started, the area became more attractive in its own right, because a new settler moving in would be guaranteed neighbors. So it's not just tree cover or topography, but those were certainly important considerations in the first couple of years. Now, imagine you've picked out your parcel, you've entered your purchase, and you've made your way 40 miles through the wilderness from Detroit all the way out here to Highland. What's the first thing you're going to want to do? Anyone?
Build a house. Yeah.
Shelter. Shelter, absolutely. You've got a wife and children to look after. There are still bears and wolves running around. There's always the chance of rain, and you need a place to hunker down. But of course it takes time to cut timbers and square them and build a cabin. So unless you brought a tent with you, which was a rather extravagant indulgence, the first thing you did after arriving at your purchase was to erect what was commonly called a shanty or a bough house. And this is a fair example of what they are. It's the same sort of temporary shelter or structure that Boy Scouts and some hunters will build even today. In fact, this particular image is from an old Boy Scout manual from the early 1900s. Simple lean-to structure made with poles, covered with evergreen boughs or strips of bark, maybe toss some dirt on there to hold everything in place. You could then enclose the sides with saplings in a kind of woven wattle wall, and maybe hang a blanket in the front to block some of the wind. Here in Highland, though, there was at least one family that took a much different, and as far as I can tell, wholly original approach. Duncan McCall was a Scotsman, who came to Highland in 1834 along with his father-in-law, Robert Finley. They had been city people. They were residents of Glasgow, and they knew next to nothing about pioneer life or farming. They were truly babes in the woods. Now, as it happens, their land, which was on the east side of Milford Road, down near the high school, was rather hilly. So instead of building a above-ground shanty, they dug a trench into the side of the hill, covered it over with some poles and bark and boughs, and essentially lived for several weeks or months in a man-made cave. We'll have occasion to mention the McCalls again because this wasn't the only example of how they did things just a little bit different than the rest of Highland's early settlers. Let's talk a bit about log cabins. Building a proper cabin, or a log house as it was often called, was far more involved than you might think. There are some accounts by old settlers who claim they put one up in 2 days. That may be true for the actual raising when you and the neighbors got together, but the work needed to reach that point would have taken far longer, and the vast majority of the accounts that I've read talk in terms of 2, 3, and in some cases 4 or more weeks. So what was involved? Well, as surprising as it may seem, the first thing you typically did was to decide where you wanted your forever house. When we talk about pioneer life, we often forget that most of the folks coming here were looking forward to the day, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, when the community would have developed to the point that it would have had a mill and stores and blacksmiths to make hinges and skilled tradesmen that would have allowed them to build a proper frame house. In other words, like the shanty, a cabin was just another type of temporary, albeit longer term, shelter. And you lived in it only until you were wealthy enough or had access to the materials and skills necessary to build a true frame house. Once you decided where that forever house was going to go, then you could build your cabin close enough to it so that when the time came you could turn it into a coop or a shed or a small barn, but not so close that you'd have to tear it down before the main house was built. After you chose the location, then you went out and you started felling timber. Ideally the straightest oak or other hardwoods that you could find. Saws were around, but the steel was brittle. They would often bend, break, or crack. And saws were not only expensive, but you also required a set of tools like files and a saw set to keep them in good repair. An axe, however, was a much more rugged and versatile tool. If it got dull, you could sharpen it with a stone that you plucked out of the ground. If you broke the handle, you could whittle out a new one out of a piece of hickory or oak. And of course, an axe can also serve as a makeshift hammer or even as a weapon if you needed it to defend yourself. Once you got your logs felled and limbed, and typically we're talking anywhere from 40 to 50 logs for a good-sized cabin, then you hitched your team, almost always oxen as we'll discuss later, and you hauled them to the build site where you would then hew them square and chop or chisel out the notches at the ends that would help lock everything together. A job that was both back-breaking and carried a real risk of injury. If you were lucky, you had one of these. This is known as a hewing axe or a squaring axe. It was specifically made to allow you to take a round log and make it square. Basically, you would take your log, lay it on a pair of short logs that got it up off the ground. You would go along and cut a series of notches, maybe 6 to 8 inches apart, and then walk along the top with your regular axe in a process that was sort of like chiseling out the big chunks. Then you use this guy. And the thing about this axe that makes it unique is three things, really. First of all, one edge is completely flat. Normal axe is sharpened to a point. This is sharpened more like a chisel, so that when you came down on the side of the log, the face of this would go straight down, giving you a nice straight cut. The second thing that's interesting about it is they were always equipped with an offset handle. This is not particularly good example, but it is offset. And that was so that your knuckles could hopefully stay out of the way as you're bringing this thing down on your log. Last but not least, you'll notice it's symmetrical. So if you were right-handed or left-handed and your axe was set the other way, it was a simple matter to flip this over, rotate the handle, and you could convert this from a right-handed to a left-handed squaring axe without a great deal of difficulty. A neat little tool. That one happens to be set up left-handed, which I find interesting. Now some of you may be thinking, why go to all that trouble? Why not just leave the doggone logs round? I mean, after all, Lincoln logs are round. By the way, anybody know the story of Lincoln logs, the history of them? Yeah, you know because I told you. Little bit of trivia. If you look way down here, you'll see that Lincoln logs are manufactured by the J.L. Wright Company in Chicago, Illinois. J.L. Wright was, ironically enough, John L. Wright, the son of the most modern American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a bit of irony for you, that the son of the man that built the Guggenheim would develop a toy that has frontier characteristics. Anyway, Lincoln logs are round. A lot of the log houses you see built today use round logs. The little cabin that's down in Milford, Southside Park, that uses round logs. By the way, those logs were harvested about 100 feet due south of this building. When they widened M59, they took the trees down, and my family donated them to the folks down in Milford to build the cabin. And last but not least, Fess Parker had round logs, right? Well, there was in fact one early Highland settler that used round logs. The old history of Oakland County says that Nahum Curtis used round logs, quote, not deeming it expedient to hew them, as he only occupied the home for about 2 years, close quote. In other words, round logs were so unusual that they were noteworthy. Why? Because they were generally seen as a sign of either laziness or shoddy workmanship. Now, why is that? Well, if you build with round logs, the area in which you have to put this chinking, that's the mix of mud and clay and grass and little stone, is very, very limited. And it's all sitting on a rounded surface, so gravity is working against you. And the minute it rains, that water is going to come rolling down the side of this curved surface, run in there, and wash the chinking out. If you hew a log square, you can go along and you can put a wedge of material behind it, pound it in. That helps seal up that inside crack. It also keeps the long stretch of logs from sagging in the middle. And now you have a solid surface that you can pack all of that chinking, the mud, the stone, and everything. Gravity is working for you because it's all resting on a nice flat surface. And when it rains, the water comes straight down and pretty much avoids any running in there to wash it out. So that's why they went through all that trouble. Now, none of our cabins here in Highland, unfortunately, have survived, but we are lucky to have this one photo. This is the cabin of Jesse Tenney that was built in 1833. You'll notice it's a 1.5-story affair. These little black spots are the ends of the joists for the second floor. And as you can see, it uses squared timbers. And the same is true of a lot of other cabins in the area. This is the Asa Pryor cabin that was down on Stobart Road in Milford, just south of the Proving Grounds. Again, 1.5 stories, more or less squared timbers. Up in Rose, this is the George Pittenger cabin that was in section 23, not too far from where Deal's Orchard is. And again, squared timbers with a second-story loft. And finally, we have the John Gardner cabin. This was section 19 of Rose, near the intersection of Hickory Ridge and Rose Center Road. Again, 1.5 stories, more or less squared timbers. That second-story loft, by the way, was a pretty efficient use of space and materials. It only required, as you can see, a couple extra courses of logs going up, and you ended up with double the floor area and a convenient place to sleep at night. Getting up in there was not always easy, since nobody went to the trouble of building stairs as we know them. Most often you'd use a crude ladder. Some ingenious settlers are known to have drilled holes into the side walls and put pegs that you'd climb up, kind of like going up a rock wall today. Some would take a big log and chop crude steps in it and lean that up in the hole. As far as the roof goes, many of these cabins were initially covered with bark or brush while the settler went about the rather tedious job of splitting and shaping hundreds of shakes, long wooden shingles 3 or 4 feet long, and these would be placed across the framework of the roof and either nailed or pinned to it. There's also a handful of Michigan cabins, one up in Tyrone Township, for example, that were covered with a very unique system called a trough roof. It deserves to be better known because I think it's so ingenious. Trough roof meant that you got some softwoods, split them down the middle, and then hollowed out the inside to make a semicircular trough. And you would then lay these from the peak down to the eaves like a bunch of gutters laid side by side. You'd then take another set of hollowed out troughs and put that upside down over the intervening gaps. It was very much like the tile roofs that you see in Mediterranean countries or in Latin America. Very ingenious, as I said. I defy anyone to go to any pioneer village today and find an example because everybody's forgotten about them. They were considered very aristocratic because, of course, they used a lot more labor than just splitting out shakes, but they were also very durable. Understand, too, that whichever roof system you used, they weren't weather tight. You read all sorts of stories about people waking up in the winter time with a dusting of snow that has managed to filter its way through the cracks in the roofs and the windows and everything else. As far as windows go, by the way, the glass was expensive and it was very fragile. You're not going to get it in one piece from Detroit out here to Highland on a bumpy trail. They'd use wax paper. They'd get a nice piece of linen or cotton paper and wax it or oil it, grease it, and you couldn't see through it, but it would emit light while keeping out the draft and hopefully the bugs. As far as floors went, they invariably started out as hard-packed dirt, maybe covered with some sheets of bark, but after a year or two they were replaced with what were known as puncheons. Puncheons are rough planks made by splitting a log in half and laying them down on the ground, bark side down, and the flat split part becomes your floor. They would not have been as damp or dusty as a dirt floor, but unless you took the time to smooth them out with either an adze or sand them down with a big flat stone, I suspect they were a bit tricky to walk on with bare feet. We know that puncheons were used in this area thanks to an old Milford Times article that talks about one of the town's older stores there being torn down, and as they lifted up the sawn wood floor, there were still puncheons underneath it.
How do you spell that word?
Puncheon. Puncheon. Now, assuming you built your cabin in the spring or summer months, you didn't have an immediate need for a fireplace. You could cook outside over an open fire, and your time, frankly, was better spent clearing land and getting in that first crop. As fall approached, however, you'd chop an opening in one end of the cabin, and you'd build a hearth or a firebox out of stone that you'd been hauling out. And again, you'd use a crude mortar made from clay and maybe some wood ash to glue everything together. Now, unless you built a raging fire in this, the actual flame in a fireplace like that typically doesn't go more than a foot or two above the floor level. Above that is just smoke. Hot, to be sure, usually not so hot as to set something on fire. So before brick and metal stovepipe became available, the actual chimneys for these cabins were often made of wood and clay. You would take short lengths of wood, 3 or 4 feet long, maybe 5 or 6 inches in diameter. You'd lay them up Lincoln log fashion, and you'd plaster them inside and out with a thick layer of mud or clay. And that was your chimney. They were known by a variety of different names. Some called them a stick and mud chimney. Some called them a Welsh chimney or a Dutch chimney. My favorite name is the one they called them down south, mudcat chimney, because the sticks poking out of the end of the chimney looked like the snout of a catfish in the mud. For obvious reasons, these things didn't survive, but I have found an example. This is one down south. You can see the stone hearth. Everything above that is just the wood and mud in between, and that was your chimney. You're probably thinking that that is a disaster waiting to happen, and sometimes it was. If that clay liner cracked off inside, or if your fire got too hot, you could set the chimney on fire and end up burning the whole cabin down. And there's stories of that happening in various Michigan histories. The more prudent settlers took a variety of steps to prevent that, mainly by keeping their fires low. Remember, the fire was primarily there to cook food. It would be burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, summer as well as winter. It was not primarily a source of heat. You might come in and sit by the hearth to take the chill off in the winter. But when you went to bed up in that drafty old loft, it was your clothes and quilts and coverlets that was keeping you warm, not a fire downstairs. So what these folks wanted was a low, slow-burning fire that produced a good bed of coals that you could set a pot on or cover a Dutch oven with and cook with. And that type of fire would pose less of a risk of damage. It was also fairly common to leave a ladder, either leaning against the roof or handy, so that if the chimney did catch fire, you could climb up in the roof and literally just push the whole thing over. It's only mud and clay, right? There were even some ingenious chimneys that were built with an intentional leaning away from the house, and then they would put 1 or 2 long poles against them to hold them up. If the chimney got on fire, you went out with your axe or your mallet, knocked those poles out of the way, and the chimney would fall over on its own weight. As far as your water supply was concerned, those who lived within a reasonable distance of a pond or spring or stream, and reasonable might mean a half a mile or more, would send the older kids out with a bucket to fetch it. Janet McCall, who was the daughter of Duncan McCall I mentioned earlier, wrote in her reminiscences, quote, "There used to be a long hill which we had to go down to get water, and I used to hate to carry that water up that hill from the springs at Pettibone Lake. Once in a while we could see frogs jumping in it, but we had to drink it just the same," close quote. Think about that as you enjoy your nice bottle of filtered, purified water. Of course, if you wanted to minimize the chances of froggy water, then you dug a well, which was another dirty, backbreaking, dangerous job. Imagine standing in a hole 4 feet or so in diameter, 20 feet or more deep, using a shovel to fill a bucket with dirt and rocks, having someone up top haul it to the surface and dump it, and then send it back down to you to fill up again. If you've ever tried to dig out the cover of a septic tank, you know what a job that is. Multiply that by about 10 times. Cave-ins were the biggest threat, obviously, since they could bury you alive, but something as simple as somebody kicking a stray pebble off the rim of that thing, by the time it falls and knocks you on the head, you could get a pretty nasty injury. And then finally, once you struck water, you'd need to begin the process of lining that hole with either log cribbing or stone, working from the bottom all the way up. Back when I restored our family's ancestral home, we uncovered the original well that would have been dug in the mid-1830s. And here's a photo that I took of it at the time. I confess to you that I was too scared. The thing might cave in to get much closer than what you see. But I did tie a weight on a string, toss it down there, and it ended up dropping about 30 feet. Now just think about that. Not only digging it down 30 feet, but then having someone lower all of that stone so that you could stand down there and arrange them all in a nice circle and backfill them to lock them in place. I can't imagine doing that. Anyway, you've got your land, you've built your cabin, you've taken care of water and other immediate needs. What do you think the next step is?
Clearing the land.
Pardon?
Clearing the land.
Clearing the land, absolutely. Got to clear the land and get that first crop in. And this is another point at which having a piece of oak opening proves so valuable. Let's look at that photo again. Notice how nice and clear it is under those trees and how far apart the trees are themselves. There is plenty of open area there in which to plant a crop, so long as it got enough sunlight. So the first step in clearing land like this would be taking your axe and going for a nice leisurely walk and girdling, that is to say, taking a strip of bark from all the way around every one of those tree trunks. By doing so, you prevented the sap from rising to the top. You've killed the tops of the trees. Come spring, they can't leaf out, and you have all the sunlight that is now filtering down through the dead branches and hopefully helping your wheat, corn, or vegetables to grow. You didn't need to fell the trees right away. You'd let them sit there that first season. They would dry out in the process, and come fall, after you got your harvest in, you had all this nice seasoned hardwood that you could either use for firewood or fell and lay aside for future building projects. It was a very crude way to farm, but if you were lucky, it would get enough of a yield to get you through that first year, after which you could start clearing your land in earnest. Now, what would they plant? Well, suffice to say, these folks weren't stupid, and they were not concerned about what today we call cultural appropriation, so they planted many of the same crops that the native peoples planted. Corn, beans, and squashes, what was traditionally known as the Three Sisters. Corn could be pounded in a crude mortar and pestle to make cornmeal or johnny cake. Beans and peas were pretty easy to grow, and you could dry them for the winter to make soups or stews. And of course the squashes, if they were hard squashes, they would keep pretty much most of the winter. And if they were gourds, you could dry them out, hollow them out, and use them to make either a ladle or little containers to keep the peas and beans in. Wheat was also widely planted, although it initially meant having to haul it all the way to some other town that had a mill to grind. There are stories in a lot of local histories where the flour barrel is getting low and the husband takes the team and wagon and heads off 20 or 30 miles to the nearest mill to have more flour ground. Meanwhile, the wife and the kids are starving, and so she gets out the coffee grinder, runs the crude wheat through the coffee grinder, sifts whatever flour that produced through a piece of muslin, takes the remnant, puts it back in the coffee grinder, and manages to make enough crude flour that she could bake some bread and keep the kids satisfied. Now, it's important to understand that not every settler needed to plant everything. As I said, these folks came out here often together in groups, and so they naturally relied on each other. So you might plant corn and somebody else plant beans, and you barter. Indeed, given how little coin or currency was in circulation, nearly every transaction during the pioneer period involved barter of one sort or another, either goods or services. Once again, Janet McCall gives us an example. She was part of that family, as I said, that lived down on the west side of Pettibone Creek. Enos Leake, who was another early settler, lived on the east side of the creek, and his wife Rebecca had just had a baby. And Janet says, quote, "Mrs. Leake thought I should tend her baby. So I agreed to, and she gave me a pound of wool a week for it. I took the wool and had it spun. There was a family by the name of Smith that lived on Brush Street. Brush Street is West Wardlow Road. He wove, so of course he was engaged to weave that piece of goods. I used to go up there every day on foot to see if he had got it done yet. I was so anxious to see how it looked," close quote. Now this would have been in the early 1840s, but I've no doubt the same thing is happening day in and day out from the very beginning of settlement. You watch my baby, I'll pay you in wool. You take the wool to somebody else to be spun, then take it to someone else to be woven, and at each step along the way, you get or give something in return. Now, as it turns out, Highland quickly developed a reputation for its grain production, especially corn and wheat. There was a doctor up in Fenton by the name of Samuel Pattison. Fenton used to be called Dibbleville, by the way. And as he notes in his recollections, quote, "It soon became known that a physician had settled at Dibbleville, and I had professional calls at quite a distance to Highland, White Lake, Grand Blanc, Deerfield, Heartland, etc., close quote. Of relevance for our purposes here, however, is Pattison's recollection about how scarce provisions were when he first settled. Specifically, he says he remembers, quote, paying $15 for a barrel of flour. A barrel of flour was 196 pounds. And every kind of edibles in proportion. Much of corn, oats, etc. came from Ohio, but Tenney settlement, meaning Highland, was our Egypt. There was corn there," close quote. Those of you that know your Old Testament will remember Jacob telling his sons, "Go down to Egypt, I hear there's corn there, buy us some so we won't starve." By the way, at this time, the word corn still carried its original Old English meaning of any small grain. When somebody in the 19th century refers to corn, it could be wheat, rye, oats, etc. If you specifically wanted to identify what we call corn, you called it maize, or Indian corn. There are other references that confirm Pattison's impression. James D. Rowe was the son of Squire Rowe, the family that built Stone Row. He recalls that, quote, "The virgin soil produced abundantly, 40 bushels of wheat to the acre being a common yield." Another fellow was P.A. Wilsey. He was an old pioneer in Milford. He was a bit more modest, giving 20 to 30 bushels per acre is typical. Either way, those are very impressive yields. even if you allow for a little bit of boasting. The USDA statistics show, for example, that in the mid-1860s, the average U.S. wheat yield was just 12 acres to the bushel, or 12 bushels to the acre. So Highland is clearly at the top of the production. In that regard, it's interesting to look at some statistics that are found on the agricultural schedules to the 1850 census. This was the first time that the Census Bureau not only wanted to count people, but they also sought to gather information about how many acres these people owned, what sort of crops they grew, what their livestock consisted of, etc. It was really the first systematic economic survey of the nation. Here in Highland, for example, those schedules give detailed information on 120 different farms. And I spent a week transcribing all of that data and putting it in an Excel spreadsheet so that I could sort and filter it in different ways, and it's been a very interesting exercise. Here in Highland, for example, in 1850, 106 farms growing wheat with a total of 19,890 bushels. At 60 pounds a bushel, we're talking about 600 tons of wheat produced, clearly more than the folks here in Highland themselves could consume. Corn was close second, going on 101 out of 120 farms, 12,783 bushels. Rye and oats were distant runners up. Only a handful of farms raised it, and most likely for feed. Oatmeal was not a thing among New England settlers in the 1800s. The interesting thing about that wheat is it all had to be hauled, as I said, to some other town that had a mill or down to Detroit. So we're talking a 40-mile trip there. Now, how did you get to this point where you're producing this much? Clearly, this isn't just planting in between a bunch of dead trees. Those sorts of yields are only going to come when you have truly cleared your land with the trees felled, the stumps pulled out, the soil plowed and harrowed and so forth. And to do that, the pioneer needed what was the 19th century equivalent of a tractor, bulldozer, backhoe, and pickup truck all rolled into one. In short, he needed at least one team of oxen. For those of you that weren't lucky enough to be raised on a farm, let me give you a crash course in bovine terminology. Cattle, also known by the older name kine, are members of the species Bos taurus. If you ever wondered why cows are always called bossy, it comes from that Latin name. A female is called a calf up until the time she's weaned. She's a heifer then until she has her calf of her own, after which she is simply a cow. A male is called a bull calf up until he's weaned, after which he is a bull. But like bees or drones in a beehive, a bull is really good for only one thing, and that's breeding. They're aggressive. And so the vast majority of bull calves undergo an indignity I will not name, and depending upon their intended fate, are either steers if they're raised for their meat, or they become oxen if they are raised as a draft animal. By the way, most folks don't realize that unlike almost every other kind of animal, there is no singular, genderless term for cattle. What I mean by that is I can say, hey, look, there's a turkey, regardless of whether it's a hen or a tom. Or I can say, look, there's a cat, regardless of whether it's a tom or a queen. But if I say, hey, look, there's a cow, I'm indicating that it's female. To refer to a bull or a steer or an ox as a cow technically is utterly ridiculous. These days, of course, most folks ignore that distinction. We call them all cows, but if you look at the dictionary, it actually still says a fully grown female member of that species. Now, when we hear the term ox today, It often carries negative connotations. Call someone dumb as an ox and you picture them as slow, plodding, more brawn than brains, etc. For the pioneer, however, a pair of oxen, usually called either a yoke or a team, was literally worth its weight in gold. With the possible exception of the axe and other hand tools, a team was the settler's most valued and most valuable possession. In 1831, for example, a pair of oxen was sold at Detroit for $65. By 1834, when the demand had increased as more of these settlers are coming in, the team went for $80, so more than the price of that 40-acre farm. Those who couldn't afford their own team often combined purses, as the saying was, to share a team between them. And if you still doubt the regard that the settler had toward the humble ox, consider this. Oxford Township here in Oakland County was not named for the English University town. It was named because an early settler, Otis Thompson, quote, insisted that nothing could be more appropriate than Oxford, since nearly all the settlers had ox teams and probably would hold on to them for some time to come, close quote. By the way, if you wonder why you never saw oxen on all those pioneer TV shows and movies, it's probably because there weren't any in Southern California for the prop department to rent. Horses, sure, but try to find a working team in California in the 60s. This photo, by the way, is of a team down in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I chose it because it shows a pair of red Devons. That's an ancient English breed from the western part of England. It was brought to New England in the early 1600s and was pretty much our only breed until the Shorthorns began being imported in the late 1780s. Devons were a multi-purpose animal, meaning they were good for meat, milk, and draft. So it's likely that most of the cattle here in Michigan during the pioneer period were either Devons or had a good mixture of Devon heritage. So what makes an ox so valuable? Why not use horses? The Tenney brothers, in fact, brought some horses with them, but as we'll see, horses were rare, even as late as 1850. As it turns out, the very things that we think of as negatives today, slow, plodding, dull-tempered, the pioneer valued as advantages. What an ox lacks in speed, it more than makes up for in power. The general rule of thumb is that an ox can pull 2.5 to 3 times its own body weight, compared with only 1.5 times for a horse. Oxen likewise don't have any need for complex and expensive leather harness. On the contrary, the shorter neck and the broader shoulders means you can get away with a simple wooden ox yoke like you see here. There's a tradition in my family, for example, that Michael Beach spent his winters carving out ox yokes to sit by the fire and whittle them out, and would trade them to other settlers. Finally, the ability of an ox to fend for itself was greatly appreciated. Unlike a horse, it could be left to graze unattended. The sound of the bell was usually enough for you to find it. Its size and those horns also made it a match for a wolf. Particular value was the ability to feed on the coarse grasses that grew on the wet or swampy areas, so-called marsh hay, which was often the only forage that was available in the winter. Horses, of course, are a bit more finicky, needing either a finer hay or even grain, as we've seen, which was initially in short supply. So it should come as no surprise that the ox was king, and it remained so throughout the pioneer period. James Rowe remembered breaking steers to train them for draft use in the 1840s. He goes on to say that as the land became more easily worked, horses were employed, but for a number of years, at least one yoke of oxen were kept on most farms. And we see that confirmed by these statistics from the 1850 census. 79 out of 120 farms, 65%, had at least one team. 7 farms had 3 teams, 1 farm had 4 teams, and oxen are outnumbering horses 218 to 149. That's at the end of the pioneer period. There was even greater in the 1830s and 40s. Now, I've used the, well, one other thing. The interesting thing is if you look at who owned those horses, compare the names, people who had been here the longest had the horses. They'd already done the hard work of clearing and pulling out the stumps and everything that you needed the ox for. And by that time, they were settled and successful enough they could afford a horse. A lot of these ox teams were by the latecomers who were still in that process. Now, I've used the term yoke or team because that's almost always how these animals were used, a pair. Several reasons. The tasks they were used for were typically required the combined weight and power of at least 2 and often more oxen. Secondly, of course, cattle are a herd animal, so having 2 of them work together has a calming effect, makes them less skittish. And finally, having a pair makes for better control of your plow or wagon. Imagine 2 men trying to carry a couch side by side. And as they're walking forward with this couch between them, if they start going off right and left, they're going to wobble back and forth. But if they can agree to all kind of lean in toward the center, then they tend to follow a much straighter line. And you do the same thing with oxen. They are trained right and left to pull toward the center of the load, and as a result, the load tends to go straight. Just be sure you hook them up the same way every time, or you won't have that advantage. Every yoke was trained from an early age to respond to a very traditional set of verbal commands. If you wanted them to start going forward, you'd say step up, or giddy up. Want to turn right, you'd say gee. Want to turn left, you'd say haw. Whoa, of course, meant stop, and back meant put it in reverse. It was also customary and good practice to give each ox a simple individual name. Ben, Duke, Sam, what have you, so you could address them individually. So if one member of your team, Ben, let's say, was lagging a bit, you could say, Ben, step up, and he'd resume his place in the line. And that was typically all of the control that you needed. There were no bits, no collars, no reins, none of that expensive harness that a horse would require. You'd usually carry a small switch or a prod to get their attention, but you rarely had to use it, and typically only a little flick would suffice. Now, I can't leave the subject of oxen without telling you another amusing story about the McCall family. They were city folk and little or no farm experience. And Samuel McCall, a descendant, wrote a letter or had an interview that was published in the Milford Times. He says, quote, "In Detroit they purchased a yoke of oxen. Having never seen oxen before, to say nothing about driving them, grandfather, that would be Pioneer Duncan McCall, walked on one side with a prod. Great-grandfather Finley, who was an old man past 70, walked on the other side, and Alexander Finley, a young man about 18 years of age, walked in front of them with ears of corn to coax them along." I just find that delightful. What makes that story even better is that along the way, they encountered a tree across the road. And again, quoting, "So never having seen one cut, they decided to dig it up by the roots." Can you imagine? All right, now that we know all about oxen, let's talk about how they were used. You build a new building today and you have a ceremonial groundbreaking with your plated shovel, and you turn over a little clod of dirt, smile for the camera, and then let the bulldozers take over. For the pioneer, however...
Get your attention, please. The library will be closing in 15 minutes. Please bring all materials to the circulation desk to check out at this time. Thank you.
For the pioneer, however, breaking ground was another one of those dirty, exhausting jobs that I just can't imagine doing. Instead of a bulldozer or a backhoe, you had what was known as a break plow or a break-up plow sometimes called a bar share plow or a bull plow. Each of these things was sort of individually made by the local blacksmith, but they all had several elements in common. This is a drawing from an old history of John Deere, and it corresponds pretty well to the description that I find in a set of reminiscences by a Branch County settler. He says the foundation or flat of the plow was a flat plate of iron, so down here, 30 inches long, 20 inches wide, thick on one edge and thin on the other. The forward edge of this was laid with steel and made very sharp. On this, a strong wooden post stood, reaching to and mortised into the beam, the whole being fastened firmly together by strong bolts. This beam was of wood about 9 feet long and some 5 by 7 inches in size. The coulter, that's this knife part here, was made of steel and ground sharp and clamped to the beam and reached to a notch in the share. To the beam and share a mold board, rived out of a log having the proper twist, was attached. This mold board was generally protected with a covering of sheet iron, and then the handles and so forth. And he says this thing would weigh between 200 and 300 pounds, and when drawn by from 6 to 12 yoke of oxen, would break up from 1 to 2 acres of land a day, cutting a furrow 18 inches wide and 6 to 10 inches deep, and cutting off roots and stumps up to the thickness of a man's thigh, without seriously checking the progress of the team. Isn't that amazing? Guiding such a heavy and awkward piece of equipment like that was no easy task. At a minimum, it took 2 men. You needed a driver who walked in at the front of your team to guide them along, and you had the plowman who was hanging on to those handles for dear life at the back. And if a third person, say a young child, were available, you might have them walk along the side of the plow with a pole or a hook to grab the roots and the grass and whatnot that was getting hung up on the coulter. The driver, by the way, typically walked on the left side. Anyone guess why? Well, look at the way that plowshare is shaped. It's going to throw that soil to the right. So after you've made your first pass, if you're the driver walking on the right side, you'll be walking through all of that uneven, broken up, plowed soil. If you walk on the left, you're walking on hard soil. The other reason is that most people are right-handed, so the driver would want to carry his switch or prod in his right hand. If he carried it in his, if he's walking to the right side, he's got to reach across his body, which is awkward and doesn't give him the same reach. If he walks on the left side, it's just a simple matter of extending the hand and giving that oxen a little twitch. Can anybody think why that bit of trivia should have any relevance to any of you here today?
That's why we drive on the left.
Exactly.
You don't do, well, the driver sits on the left side.
Yeah, when you get in your car tonight and go home, that steering wheel is on the left side. Why? Because when he's plowing, the driver's on the left, and when the oxen are taken off the plow and used to hold a wagon, you don't want to confuse them, so you'd walk along the left pulling the wagon, you meet the approaching wagon, he's on the left, you pass left side to left side so that you don't hook your wheels together, and that's why we drive on the left. I think that's kind of neat. All right, driver had it easy. He's just keeping the team going straight. Plowman in the back had it much worse. Any of you who've ever used a rototiller know what it's like to suddenly hit a big stone and have the handles jerk up or this way and that. Imagine a 300-pound rototiller being pulled by 6 or more yoke of oxen. You're getting thrown this way and that all over. If you were unlucky and you got the plow point stuck in a big root, you couldn't just put it in reverse. You had to unhitch the whole team, bring them all the way around to the back, hook it up, pull the plow out of the root, unhitch it, walk them all the way around to the front, and hopefully commence going. And it was not a fun job. The work also took its toll on the oxen. Mary Opino Deal, whose family settled just over the line in Milford Township, recalled that, quote, "In the spring, Brother George, who was now 9 years of age, hired out to Mr. Duncan McCall of Highland to drive breakup team, as it was called. Sometimes he would come home and tell about a poor starved ox that had fallen down in the furrow and died, and then they would hitch the rest of the oxen to it and drag it away for the Indians or wolves to devour," close quote. Now you'll notice that these accounts of using plows like this are talking about 3, 4, or 5 yokes to pull them, whereas I said earlier the pioneer considered himself lucky if he had just one. The solution here, at least initially, lay in taking advantage of that support group that you had around you. You'd come out here with other friends and neighbors and family members. They had their own teams. You would simply get together and agree that I'll loan you my team this week, and you loan me yours next. And of course, after a couple years, the cattle that you were keeping would start dropping male calves, and you'd neuter those and then train them and break them to the plow. It's also worth mentioning, however, that there were a number of early settlers who chose to specialize in this breakup process. They'd go around in the wintertime, find out who wanted their fields broken, and then make a circuit with their rig in the spring to plow for either cash or whatever goods you had. Adoniram Hubble and his sons, quote, broke up much of the adjoining land for owners, keeping 5 yoke of oxen for the purpose. Hubbard Bullard over in Heartland was another early contract plowman. Suffice it to say, whether you did it yourself or hired it out, it was slow work. Those 120 farms that are listed on the 1850 schedules total 17,227 acres. Of those, only 7,885 acres, so just 46%, were improved, while over 9,000 acres were still unimproved or in their natural state. Some of that unimproved land may very well have been too wet or hilly to bother with, and some of it was probably set aside as woodlot, but still, as late as 1850, it would seem there was a considerable amount of land which, while it was owned, was still in its natural state and had yet to be cultivated. Now, by this point, I'm sure you're sick of oxen, so let me talk about some other livestock. Horses, as I said, were the exception rather than the rule. The folks most likely to own horses were those whose occupations required traveling long distance at a fairly rapid clip. That would include physicians like Dr. Pattison or Dr. Foote down in Milford, who is credited with riding through unbroken fields and great stretches of timber on horseback with his saddlebags on either side. Another group that used horses a lot were your Methodist circuit riders and other clergymen who were having to travel from church to church and town to town. And finally, you had postmasters and later on post riders who were delivering the mail. And we'll talk about that a bit more next week. As far as other livestock goes, I was very surprised to realize that swine, pigs, were not as common as you might expect, especially when you consider how easy it is to rear them. Like oxen, you could turn a pig loose and let it graze on all those nuts out in the unbroken forest. Pigs are also very prolific breeders. Single sow could have as many as 3 litters a year, with each litter being as much as 10 piglets. The problem, as it turned out, is that they were actually too prolific, given that there was no good way to get them to market. Alice McKeever, who was down in Milford, recalled her mother saying, quote, "They had one delicacy sometimes which we are not accustomed to. Roast pig, not roast pork. Little pigs about 6 weeks old were often killed, dressed, and roasted whole. The reason for this seemingly heartless slaughter of innocent creatures was that there was no market for pork, so it was not advisable to raise more hogs than could be used for home consumption, close quote. And the statistics in the 1850 census seem to support this. Swine were present on 115 out of 120 farms, but most farms had less than 10 head. Only a handful of settlers appeared to have raised swine commercially. Royal Baker, for example, had 80 head. His father, Thomas Baker, had 30, and there were a handful of others that had herds between 13 and 20. And this is after 18 years of settlement. I'm sure the numbers were far less back in the 30s and 40s. Other livestock included milk cows, as well as cows raised for beef or breeding, and sheep. In 1850, milk cows, 119 out of 120 farms had at least one milk cow, but none had more than 6. So it's clear that all of the dairy products, the milk and the butter and the cream and the cheese and so forth, are being consumed more or less locally than being sent to market. Same was true of beef cattle. Only 85 out of 120 farms owned such other cattle, and no farm had more than 11 head. So the meat, tallow, and leather are obviously being used here as well. Part of the problem with a beef cow is, you slaughter a 1,000-pound animal, there's more meat there than you can use. So there wasn't a necessity for everybody to have one. And here again, the kind of neighbor helping neighbor and barter system no doubt came into play. The one animal which predominates over all others raised in early Highland, believe it or not, is sheep. That's somewhat surprising given that wolves and other predators were still known well into the late 1840s. But in 1850, we had a total of 2,332 sheep being kept in the township. Of 120 farms surveyed, 101 owned at least one sheep, and several had herds of considerable size. Jesse Tenney led the township with 100 head. David Ellis and Thomas Baker had 90 head each. These animals were undoubtedly raised for wool, since a packed or baled fleece would have been easier to transport than a live sheep. And you'll recall in this regard the story about Mrs. Leake paying Janet McCall in wool. Initially that wool would have been spun here. By the 1840s there were some commercial woolen mills that were beginning to spring up. Seth Petty's had a fulling mill in Hamburg in the 1840s, and the Hebbard and Davis mill opened up in Milford in around 1851. Now, so far we've talked about felling timber, building a cabin, clearing land, and so forth. And as I mentioned several times, this was all exhausting, back-breaking work, even for a young man in relative good health. But of course, good health was never guaranteed. All of those chores I just mentioned posed innumerable risks of injury or worse. Clearing the woods or building a cabin meant swinging an axe hundreds, if not thousands of times, and every swing carried with it the potential for a foot or a leg getting in the way. Janet McCall, again in her recollections, says that as a young girl, she heard her folks talking about how the road needed to be cleared out in front of their house. So she and her brother both grab an axe, go out there, and the first thing she does is slice her knee open. Even just walking through the woods was a hazard. There was a risk from what were called widowmakers, which was a morbid, if nonetheless apt term for a dead tree or a dead limb which may decide to come down at just the wrong time and whack you on the head. In addition to trauma, there was also disease, in particular the malaria that I mentioned earlier. Back then it was more commonly called the ague or the agar, a name that...
Can I have your attention, please? The library is now closed, and we will reopen
This ague or agar, it was also called Michigan fever. It is said that the disease was, quote, so prevalent that it was unusual to escape it. So it's not surprising that there were any number of quacks selling all sorts of nostrums and patent medicines. This is out of the Pontiac-Jacksonian paper in 1847 for Mackenzie's Tonic Febrifuge, the infallible health restoring properties, fever and ague destroyer. Thankfully, it was rarely fatal except to the very young and the very old, and the settlers pretty much adopted a rather stoic attitude toward it. It is said that a common joke was, he ain't sick, he's just got the agar. And yet it was a very nasty, debilitating disease. There's one delightful account here that hopefully I'll have time to just summarize. He says, we could always tell when the ague was coming on by the premonitory symptoms, the yawnings and stretchings. And if the person understood the complaint, he would look at his fingernails to see if they were turning blue. No disease foretold its coming with such unerring signs. The adept could detect its approach before it got within 10 rods of him. At first, the yawns and stretching stole upon you so naturally that for a time you felt good in giving way to them. But they were soon followed by cold sensations that crept over your entire system in streaks, faster and faster, and grew colder and colder, as in successive undulations they coursed down your back. There you laid in the frigid ague region for an hour or so until you gradually stole back to a temperate zone. Then commenced the warm flashes over your system, which increased with heat as the former did with cold, until you reached the torrid region, where you lay in burning heat, racked with pain in your head and along your back for an hour. When finally you began by degrees to feel less heat and pain, until your hands grew moist and you were relieved by a copious perspiration all over your body. Getting back to your normal condition, you felt relieved and happy. And as you went outdoors, everything about you was pleasant and smiling, and you seemed to be walking in a brighter and happier world. I think that's the most romantic description of a disease I've ever read. Now, as I said, they thought this was due to fumes coming out of the ground. There was a doctor in commerce, Dr. Hoyt, who thought that minute dust particles kicked up by plowing got inhaled and caused this. Everybody seemed to realize that it was a warm weather disease, and everybody understood that it was associated with swamps and lakes and standing water. Nobody made the association with the mosquitoes. Now, I was going to go through some of the doctors in the area. We've talked about Dr. Foote. Highland didn't get its first doctor until the mid-1840s. That was Dr. Isaac Pickering. He was from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, came here around 1840, and was our first township physician up until his death in 1862. He's buried out in West Highland Cemetery, by the way. Speaking of disease, one of the most interesting outbreaks occurred in August of 1847, when Herr Dreisbach's great menagerie came to Milford, and they put on a show, complete with an elephant who appears to have been named Hannibal. Herr Dreisbach, whose real name was Jacob, was one of the first, if not the first, to train and exhibit exotic animals in North America, even before Barnum. Anyway, he came to Milford, and it's no surprise that when a circus like that comes to a pioneer town, everybody went from Milford, Commerce, Highland, Heartland, as far away as Byram. And there's a delightful account of it by E.F. Albright of Milford, who says, quote, "The tent was packed with perspiring humanity in their Sunday best, besides a great many other animals clothed upon with a very loud odor," close quote. Not surprisingly, everybody who went got sick. Albright says that for 2 weeks after the circus left town, there were more residents of Milford who were confined to their beds than there were folks up and about. It's unclear whether this was the flu, food poisoning, or what, but it was a big outbreak. Being mindful of the time, I'm going to kind of skip through much of the rest of this. I would like, though, to comment just briefly. Since we've talked about disease, let me talk a little bit about death and dying. You often hear that life expectancy in the 1830s, 1840s was maybe in the 40-some year range. That statistic is a little bit misleading because it includes all of those infant deaths, and since the infant mortality rate was much higher than now, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, if you have a 1-year-old and an 80-year-old, their average life expectancy works out to be 40 years, right? A much more valuable way of looking at it is life expectancy at age 20. You've made your way through all the pains of childbirth and childhood diseases and so forth. And if you made it to 20 in the early 1800s, you had a good chance of having 40 years. That is to say, someone 20 years old might very well live to be 60. And if you look at the census records here, as well as the dates in all of our pioneer cemeteries, you find that old age was quite common. The 1840 census gives us a population of 567 people, of whom 235 were age 20 or older, that is to say adults. Of those, 24 were 50 or older, including 4 between 60 and 70, and 3 between 70 and 80. So while infant mortality was a problem, once you made it to 20, you stood a good chance of living a ripe old age. Our earliest death in the township was Samuel Stratton. He died April 24, 1834, so just about a year after settlement started taking off. I'm not sure his death is representative because he had a history of mental illness. He was known to strip off all of his clothes and run out into the woods and spend a week in the wild living off nuts and berries until he'd recover and make his way home. He was buried, by the way, on the farm of his brother Jonathan Stratton, which was just down Milford Road there where the entrance to Prestwick is. And I'm sure there were others who were initially buried on the family farm. There was a small informal cemetery that was down near Gilroy's. Janet McCall remembered that there were quite a few burials there, including that of her grandfather, and that when she and her friends would get out or from school, they'd go to the little graveyard and play on their way home. Once Highland Cemetery was established here on North Milford Road, most of the bodies were taken up and reinterred. Our first formal cemetery, of course, was at West Highland. It was originally laid out in 1835 or 36. Land was donated by Mr. John C. Morse, and it initially served burials in the Tenney settlement and parts of eastern Heartland. The Highland Baptist Church took over the land in 1841, and they owned it up until 1927, when the West Highland Cemetery Association assumed control. It wasn't until 1977 that West Highland Cemetery actually became a public cemetery owned by Highland Township. All of which explains why we have another cemetery, Highland Cemetery, on Milford Road. In 1847, the legislature passed a statute requiring every township to establish a Board of Health, and every Board of Health was required to purchase and thereafter maintain a public burying ground. So even though we had the cemetery at West Highland, it wasn't township owned, which is why we have this one. Originally that was called the Highland Center Burying Ground because this area used to be known as Highland Center, being in the rough geographical center of the township. With that, I'm going to conclude this evening. I could talk about this stuff for hours. I'll have another session next week, but I feel like the oxen. I've been a bit plodding and dull this evening. So next time we will cover things such as native peoples, trails and roads, postal service, religious life, township government, and so forth. And I sure hope I'll see most of you back. Thank you.